When anyone starts to talk about the beginnings of the cinema, you expect to hear famous names like Friese-Greene in England and D.W. Griffith in America, but I doubt if any of the books on cinema history mention a Mr. Smith and a Mr. Williamson of Brighton. And yet they were working on their own, making films and doing things that were possibly every bit as pioneering as the work done by the famous people. In fact, they probably made the very first story film in this country. Their work came to light at the opening of the Brighton branch of the National Film Theatre, when some of their old films were shown. We are going to show you some of that film now, which incidentally was discovered after devoted detective work by John Huntley of the British Film Institute, who tells the story.
The first glimpse English audiences ever had of the cinema, more or less as it is today. It was the Lumiere programme that was shown in London in 1896. You'd think we'd know the basic facts about the history of the cinema. After all, it only happened 70 years ago. Well, we don't. We don't know who did the first close-up or the first trick film. We don't really know who began the idea of simple storytelling or who did the first colour film. Come to that, we don't even know for sure exactly who invented it. As a result of this, film historians have tended to lump all these experiments on one man, the great American director, D.W. Griffith.
But in 1947, a French film historian, Georges Sadoul, on a holiday visit to Brighton, met an old projectionist, Edward Austin, who described how story, comedy and trick films were made and shown in Brighton in the late 90s, long before Griffith made his first film in 1907. Intrigued by Sadoul's account of these forgotten filmmakers, I wanted to meet the people who knew them, and above all, to find out if any of the films survived. In the Science Museum, there were a few pieces of their apparatus. But in Hove, I met a veteran aviator, Graham Head, who'd been a passionate film collector since the age of 10. He has literally tons of it. Not only had he preserved bits of the Brighton films, he was able to take me on a tour of the streets of Hove to see the sites of the original studios. In one case, even though newer factory buildings have since sprung up, the outline of the old laboratory and studios, as they were in 1902, can still be seen. It was here that they made their equipment, shot their films, developed and printed them. And so I came to learn of two respectable and rather high-minded late Victorian gentlemen who had turned to filmmaking as early as 1896. Mr. James Williamson, chemist of 86 Church Road, Hove. And another local resident,
George Albert Smith, portrait photographer and lantern lecturer from Hove, went out one Saturday evening and saw at the Empire Leicester Square the Lumiere programme. He liked it so much that on the way home he decided that he too must make films. On the following Monday he was in touch with a local engineer, Alfred Darling, and 2 months afterwards he had his own movie camera. And like the Lumieres, the first experiment he made was to record the workers leaving a factory.
Mr. Smith made dozens of little films in his back garden and in the streets of Brighton. In spite of promoting scientific and educational films to show at lantern lectures, it was always the comedies that sold. Around 1898, he built his own studio, where he filmed against painted backcloths and made films like A Kiss in the Tunnel, which combines actuality tracking shots with studio incidents which feature Mr. Smith himself.
just before he died in 1959, I went down to Hove to see Mr. Smith in search of more facts and more films. He met us at the front door, showed us inside the house with his records, his catchbooks, and on a very battered old tape recorder, we documented a few reminiscences.
I was making black and white pictures in 1897.
What sort of subjects did you begin with?
Natural subjects like rough seas and things of that sort, you know. And then I got on to comedies. And, in fact, I rather kept to comedies. I had a pretty good long list of all sorts of things, gymnastics, you know, you used to think about, you know, before you got up in the morning and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And store it up in your mind or make a note of it, and then develop it when the time came to it. I did the story of Cinderella in 75 seconds.
It's an incredible coincidence that 3 streets away from Smith's little studio, there lived and worked a Hove chemist, James Williamson. Just as Smith had been fired with enthusiasm for films as a result of seeing the Lumiere program, so Williamson became deeply interested in filmmaking as a result of a chance meeting with William Friese-Greene. Friese-Greene was played by Robert Donat in a film made in 1951, The Magic Box.
Now then, where are you off to?
Come quickly, come on, come and see.
Now, just a minute. What is all this?
No, come and see. I've got something to show you. Something I've done. You must come and see.
Something you've done?
Yes, come on, and I'll show you. It's only a little way. You see, I've only just done it. I was frightened, I don't mind telling you, frightened out of my wits, but I've done it. And though I dare say it's very foolish of me, I feel I've simply got to show someone. And the joke is, Cousin Alfred didn't even know what I was doing. He just stared and said, "Hello, Willie, what have you got there?" And now there he is, and you can see him, almost as if he were alive. Here we are now. Now, would you mind turning out your lamp? Good. Now, what's that white sheet?
Hyde Park. I recognized it. Where's it come from? And where's it gone to?
It's all here. You know, it's a quite extraordinary feeling. Something you've been wondering about and dreaming about for 15 years. And then, all of a sudden, it's there. It's in your hands. With a life of its own.
You must be a very happy man, Mr. Friese-Greene.
Well, I'm afraid Friese-Greene's claims are not as sound as this plaque in Brighton suggests. Nevertheless, he did play a part in bringing Mr. Williamson into films, as I discovered when I traced one of Mr. Williamson's sons, now living near Cookham on the River Thames.
How was it that your father came into films in the first place?
Well, I think it's mainly because he was a chemist, established at Hove. And as a chemist, anybody who was in any way interested in photography or cinematography photography came to him for chemicals. And he once made contact with Friese-Greene, and that whetted his interest in the new science of what they called kinematography. I think that's how it started.
And how did it all begin in the sense of studios and equipment?
Well, there was very little equipment available, and I think Father made his first camera out of bits and pieces, and started experimentally just taking odd shots, because, of course, you could only get film in 50-foot lengths, and that limited his scope quite a lot.
Say you'd been going on a visit to the studios around 1900. What would a visitor actually have seen as he came through the gate?
Studios? There weren't any studios.
Nothing at all?
Nothing at all. No, just ordinary. Yeah.
But later on, you had these glass-roofed studios.
Oh, that was much later. In 1902, Father built a studio in Wilbury Road, Hove, which had a glass roof and a track for the camera, and there was a separate works for doing all the processing. But it was very much a one-man band, and Father used to prepare the film, write the script, supervise all the acting, do the processing, and eventually show it. And, he had a Saturday night show at the Hotel Hall, which has since burnt down.
Attack on a Chinese Mission. Now, this is a very remarkable film because I think today it would be considered as one of the very first examples ever of a piece of reconstructed fiction storytelling. But I believe, in fact, the film was purported to be the truth at the time, a newsreel.
I don't know where it was reported. It was actually taken. People were quite excited to think that it was a news report. Well, naturally, it was just a fake film. And that was taken to this place, Ivy Lodge. And the principal actors were my sister and my brother. And as far as I was concerned, I was noises off, as you might say. I was deputed to produce smoke coming through the windows. And at the critical moment, I remember Father screaming, "More smoke!" But I disappeared through the floor. It was all rotten, and I'd fallen through the floor.
In contrast to that single surviving shot from Chinese Mission, here's an interesting story, which is edited as a proper film, uses stop motion, and features a little local comic. It was made 8 years before Max Sennett and 12 years before Charlie Chaplin came into film. story, the big scene of that, of course, is when the steamroller knocks him down. Do you remember anything of that being made at all, or how it was done?
Oh, that was all reversal. Of course, you was taken in reverse. And he walked up to the steamroller. He walked stood in front of the steamroller and then walked backwards. He was taken in reverse.
And the actual scene where the man comes to life again after being pumped up, how would that have been done?
Well, that was an ordinary inflated balloon sort of thing in the clothing, and as we couldn't get enough air in it, we had to substitute that by stopping the camera and stuffing the dummy up with other things.
Comedies, actualities, both real and faked, trick effects. Smith and Williamson tried all sorts of film experiments quite unself-consciously. The Big Swallow, made by Williamson in 1901, is perhaps the first really big close-up ever shot.
This, I think, is a very interesting little item. It's a barrow cam made by the Warwick Trading Company in 1898. And this particular one was given to me by George Albert Smith, and he told me that he used to use it for taking the same films that he took with his professional cameras by setting it up alongside. And it's beautifully handmade, very probably designed by Alfred Darling, and I have some of the films which he took with it here. And this little instrument not only takes them, but also prints them and shows them as a projector. And you see, it's a narrow gauge film carrying a central perforation and silent, of course, no such thing as sound films. And the image quality is really quite good, quite high standard. One of the films that Mr. Smith gave me contains shots of his first wife, Hilda Bailey. I have actually run some of the films through this particular instrument, but what they're hoping to be able to do is to reprint them on modern 16mm films so that they can be widely shown. I would like to show you one more little feature, and that is that it has what would be quite a modern widescreen aperture ratio. You see, it's a long, not very tall picture. And here you see the central claw and the shutter turning. It's in beautiful order, and of course handmade. This would have been used by Smith in St. Answell's Gardens alongside his professional cameras.
Well, so where are we now?
This is St. Answell Gardens Hove, and that very spot is where Mr. Smith started his little cinema experimental theatre. Those two trees practically marked the spot. I remember the spot well because I came in as a lad and couldn't get as near as I should like to because I was told to keep out. In those days, St. Answell was a private company, and you paid sixpence to go in that door and came in here.
Can you remember what the studio actually looked like in those days?
Yes, it looked like a little wooden barn, and the doors opened, and they performed, or what did their little thing, a few feet off the ground.
And I noticed that it's facing towards the sun.
Yes,
so
they
must have used just natural daylight.
They were very far-sighted in those days. They chose the natural daylight as we see it now.
Yeah. And, of course, we're talking here about the old days of Smith and Williamson films, long before there were any kind of permanent cinemas, when the only place you could see films was in the music hall or on fairgrounds, or, in fact, in places like this, the old Hove Town Hall. What happened here, Mr. Head?
Well, you may well ask what happened here. Have a look around. The town hall was destroyed by fire earlier this year, and all that remains of the old balcony, for instance, in the main hall here where we're standing, is what you see there. And that is where the projector used to be set up at the turn of the century. Edward Austin, one of the operators who worked for Williamson, has told me many stories of setting up even in a field with a screen slung up between two trees which seems rather an advanced form of drive-in for those days.
Mr. Mercer, I believe you remember one of the early film shows.
Well, when I was courting, of course a long time ago now, I'll admit, there was a shop in Kingsland Road, I always recollect it, because some friends of my wife had opened it. It was just an ordinary shop that was empty. They rented it, cleared it out, put ordinary wooden forms in there, and a sheet up in the middle. They invest about £50 that way, including buying a projector for about 30, and put the projector one side, and kids was in the one side for a penny, and the adults were the other side for tuppence. And they used to project any comic films or any of the run-outs that were thrown out to the other people. Of course, that was in the early days before the LCC took over fireproof precautions. When the LCC shut down on them, of course, they were all out of business. And halfway through, they squirt on the sheet with water to make it black, so I figured a bit better picture.
How long were the films in those days?
Well, if you've got a quarter of an hour show for your tuppence, you were doing very well.
No big feature films then?
No, not that. Just little comedies, running around the houses, dog fights, and one thing and another, things like that.
When did you start making projectors yourself?
Myself, I was apprenticed in 1901. That was in Clerkenwell. We used to make projectors for quite a number of firms, and they were all issued through the House of Wrench in Gray's Inn Road. Of course, at that time, there was all hand driven, and any speed you like, you could slow down, or you could go as slow as you like or as fast as you like. And if the projectionists wanted to get home or they wanted to get you out quick, of course they speeded it up, and well, it looks like the old films do on the BBC at the present time.
And so the Brighton filmmakers made it all themselves. The cameras, and the projectors, and the films, and even the perforating machine that punched the holes in the raw stock. It's all here in the galleries of the Science Museum, along with the relics of the other pioneers. By 1910, Hollywood was in existence, in the First World War, and Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith was making Birth of a Nation and Intolerance, and Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford were known to millions. The film had become big business, and as so often happens when big business steps in, the inventors tend to get a bit left behind. And so these unconscious pioneers were swamped by the new prosperity of the industry, which they in fact had done so much to start in the first place. But there was a shadowy figure whom both Smith and Williamson claimed was in films even before their pioneer efforts, Esme Collins. I failed to discover anything about him except one fragment of film supposed to have been made in Brighton in 1896 for gentlemen's smoking concert audiences only.
And they were just teasing it. The incidental music in that, the piano accompaniment that you heard earlier in the old film, was by Arthur Dulay. And I hope that if you've got any old films stashed away in some dusty attic, you'll get in touch with the British Film Institute straight away.